Good morning. My name is Laurie Fitzmaurice, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Today, we're going to discuss engaging state-owned power companies in climate action. Let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Before we hear from our expert panelists, who range in experience from organizations such as the World Bank, private sector companies such as Quebec, and former practitioners such as the former Deputy Secretary of Energy from Mexico, and our own CGEP representative from founding director, Jason Bordoff, I'd like to turn to Philip Benoit, Adjunct Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, who will share some welcoming remarks. Philip?
Thanks, Laurie, and it's a real pleasure to be here for this important event with us and to talk about this important class of actors that are often overlooked when we think about climate change. What I wanted to do is just very briefly share a couple of slides to help set the scene in this regard. And so at the Center on Global Energy Policy, we have started to look more deeply at the role of state-owned power companies and state-owned enterprises generally in the climate energy transition. And one of the reasons is really reflected in some data that is a result of an ongoing study that's nearing publication that's being done by myself and my colleague, Alex Clark. And what we've done is actually try to identify the emissions from state-owned enterprises. And they end up being a lot. We've identified about 9 gigatons of emissions from state-owned enterprises generally. And that includes emissions from state-owned power companies that total over 6 gigatons. Now, what's important here is, not surprisingly, a lot come from China, over 4.5 gigatons. But there are also a lot of emissions from state-owned power companies from outside of China. And what's striking is when we look at the total emissions from state-owned power companies, if we were to add them all up, they exceed those of the United States and every other country other than China. So in some ways, all these state-owned power companies would, if we put all the CEOs in a room together, would be the second largest emitter in the world. Now, one of the reasons for this is because state-owned power companies own a significant share of thermal generation capacity, over 40%. What's also important to understand and recognize is that state-owned power companies are not simply providers and generators of emissions. They're also providers of zero-carbon generation alternatives. In fact, based on data from the IEA, the share of zero-carbon utility scale, zero-carbon emissions from large hydro in particular, nuclear and the right, is actually larger than their ownership of thermal power plants. And that's one reason why we're very pleased to host this event, because of the important role that state-owned power companies play, not only as large emitters, but also as suppliers of low carbon alternatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. I would like to turn to the moderated panel discussion. And again, for those watching online, my name is Laurie Fitzmaurice, and I am here with a number of distinguished panelists. I'd like to turn to Leonardo Beltran, former Deputy Secretary of Energy from Mexico. Leonardo?
Thanks very much, Laurie, and thanks very much for the invitation to join the panel. Sorry. I think, and I fully agree with the presentation of Philippe Benoit. I think there are 5 key elements that would set state-owned power companies in the path to net zero. And those 5 key items would be to strengthen corporate governance by incorporating a midterm sustainability plan with metrics to track progress, appoint a non-executive director to steer the board in that direction. Second point would be list the company or a share of the company to align the company to worldwide transparency standards, increase scrutiny from shareholders and public in general about the results of the company. Third, or have a benchmark to measure performance and progress and increase access to finance. Third point would be open strategic lines of business like transport. Electrification of transport is one of the mega trends coming in these coming years. Hard to abate sectors in partnership with fuel companies, for instance, to provide green hydrogen. Storage, certainly, and networks, telecommunications. The Internet of Things, it's another mega trend, and state-owned power companies or the power companies in general can benefit from their networks. Fourth point, invest in talent development and a new corporate culture that would embrace them internally to be the market movers towards a net zero world. And the fifth point would be internationalization. The companies would be exposed to new business models, other market dynamics, and be able to scale up operations, not only in their jurisdiction, but across the different regions or worldwide. So that would be the 5 key points that I wanted to share if we are to engage state-owned power companies in climate action. Strengthen corporate governance, list the company or a share of the company, open strategic lines of business, invest in talent development and a new corporate culture, and internationalization. Back to you, Laurie.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. And I can imagine that when we get to the Q&A, there'll be some specific questions about those 5 points. I know I have a few. I'd like to turn to Jason Bordoff, the co-founding dean of Columbia's New Climate School and founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia CEPA. Jason?
Thanks, Laurie. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks, Philip, for organizing this. I'm speaking to you from Glasgow here at the UN climate meetings, and really glad I can make able to join this conversation, and apologize I won't be able to stay for the entire panel because it's going to be a really interesting conversation on a topic that is really important for how we think about meeting the world's energy needs and the energy transition, and also a major priority for us here at Columbia at the Center on Global Energy Policy. We do have the word global in our name, and I think the breadth of the world's regions that are represented here from Mexico and Latin America, the insights you just heard from my new colleague, I'm excited to say, Leonardo Beltran, a distinguished visiting fellow, our next speaker from Canada's Hydro-Quebec, and then the last speaker responsible for the World Bank's work in East Asia, including China, Indonesia, Vietnam. These all demonstrate better than I can the importance of state-owned power companies in so much of the world. Again, maybe not so much in my own country, in the United States, but even there you have the historic Tennessee Valley Authority, a variety of municipal and other local power authorities. Even in my own home state of New York, government-owned power utilities play a big role in delivering electricity to billions of people. And as Philip mentioned at the beginning, these government-owned power companies emit a lot of greenhouse gases, more than the entire United States, the European Union. Much unsurprisingly occurs in China, where state-owned enterprises generally are responsible for about half the country's emissions. And what this all means is that we can't get anywhere, or not as far as we need to get to net zero without engaging state-owned enterprises broadly, and as we're talking about here today, particularly state-owned power companies. On the positive side, these are companies that are also major providers of zero carbon electricity alternatives. I actually hadn't appreciated that they own an even bigger share of utility scale zero carbon power capacity than thermal capacity, but I guess that isn't surprising when you consider the large hydropower plants and nuclear generation that often sits in public sector hands in many of these countries. And equally important, these power companies are often key suppliers of electricity in emerging economies and other developing countries. Not only in those countries such as Hydro-Quebec or EDF or the Tennessee Valley Authority, but in developing countries that have yet to enjoy the standards of living, or even a fraction of the standards of living we enjoy and often take for granted in advanced economies, where too many suffer in emerging markets and developing economies from extreme poverty, where even the working and middle classes often lack access to quality healthcare and other services, and electricity is one of the keys to providing those services, to providing a higher quality of life, to fighting poverty and generating prosperity. And here at the climate meetings in Glasgow at the COP, the Center on Global Energy Policy organized just yesterday, both a private roundtable and a public event with the US Development Finance Corporation, particularly to discuss these challenges. How do we think about the fact that we're going to need somewhere in the order of $100 trillion of additional investment in clean energy in between now and 2050 on a pathway to net zero? 2/3 of that roughly is going to be in emerging and developing economies, and most of that is going to be private finance, not public finance. So the topic of our event yesterday here was how to think about the ways in which public policy and public finance can catalyze and unlock private capital. Because yesterday was Finance Day and today is Energy Day, but of course those things are very, very, and that's what we're talking about on the Zoom conversation from COP in Glasgow here today, how these government-owned power companies can be major players in facilitating that energy transition. And it is for all of those reasons that I'm really excited to announce that at the Center on Global Energy Policy, we're launching a new program that targets this critical class of actors for both the climate and economic growth challenges. State-owned enterprises, national oil companies, state-owned power companies, we're talking about. The incentives that they have are often different. The policy tools that governments have to affect the way in which they operate are often different. And we need to think carefully, not just about the biggest privately owned energy companies in the world, but how to think about state-owned actors as well. This event during COP, again, where I am here in Glasgow, is just part of that effort. Through this event, we're hoping to raise the visibility of government-owned enterprises in our own climate efforts, while also recognizing their role in many countries, both advanced and emerging ones, as well as poorer developing countries, to generate greater economic growth. To be frank, I know there's much discussion and concern about the challenges that state-owned enterprises face, concerns about inefficiencies, politicization. These are important issues to continue to address, as I know many governments and institutions like the World Bank and the OECD have been doing. But at the same time, it's also clear that state-owned power companies are part of our present, will be a part of the future of many countries going forward. They are a reality, and we believe it's important to meet our common climate goals to engage and understand and study their climate actions and their efforts. So this is an effort where there are potentially important win-wins, notably for climate and for development. And again, that's why I'm pleased on behalf of the Center on Global Energy Policy in cooperation with the new climate school at Columbia to really throw our efforts and the research capabilities of a university like Columbia to understand and engage with state-owned power companies on the energy transition. So looking forward to hearing further comments, and again, apologies, I won't be able to stay for the full panel discussion, but thanks for the opportunity to talk about this today.
Thank you, Jason, and we all look forward to hearing more about the meetings in Glasgow at COP, and really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us today. I would like to turn now to Gary Sutherland, Director of Strategic Affairs and Stakeholder Relations for Northeast Markets from Hydro Quebec. Gary, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Laurie. And I'd like to thank the Center on Global Energy Policy for inviting us to this session. Thinking about kind of our position here in the Northeast and the history of Hydro Quebec, there's a couple of things that really struck me from what we've just heard, and going back to Philippe's slides and some of Jason's remarks. It very kind of mirrors the history of Hydro Quebec. I mean, we were brought together under one company back in 1944, and one of the objectives of that was really to ensure that tariffs right across Quebec would be the same for everybody. There's a lot of different, smaller, different companies that were brought under this big umbrella of Hydro Quebec. And we basically had a legacy situation where we had hydropower plants that had been kind of developed around the turn of the century, but we also had thermal generation on our system. And even when I started at Hydro Quebec about 14 years ago, we still had thermal plants. Well, we don't anymore. Our system is now entirely renewable energy. Vast majority is hydropower. We have about 37,000 megawatts of installed capacity in hydro and about 4,000 megawatts of wind on our system as well. So at any given time, and I invite everybody to see our website, we have a few metrics up there that shows you exactly what is powering our system at any given time. We're using hydro and wind energy to about 99.6% on our grid. So we've kind of gone through a transition of getting rid of those fossil fuel plants, but also looking inwards at what we do inside the company in terms of reducing our environmental footprint and especially our GHG footprint. So all the way back in 2009, we started a voluntary program of actually calculating our emissions from our operations right across the company and looking at how we could reduce those through a lot of different energy efficiency measures. And that actually brought our GHG footprint down by about 90%. So that was a great thing. Definitely not the only initiative that we've been looking at in terms of decarbonization. Decarbonization is really central to our business plan, to our strategic plans, has been for quite some time now, and is very much aligned with the plans of our stakeholder, the government of Quebec. And you know, I think we're blessed with a great geography in this case. It just happened that back in the 50s and the 60s, we massively built out our hydropower system. We've got a lot of water in Quebec. About 22% of our territory is covered in water. And that has really allowed us to come to the situation that we have today. But it is because of geography and some pretty forward thinking of some decision makers in the past, but I'd really put that on just Mother Nature. We have 61 generating stations in Hydro-Quebec that bring all this energy down from some pretty remote locations. We produce about 600 miles north of Montreal, so in a boreal forest region. James Bay, for example, where about half of our hydropower is located. We bring all that down through a vast transmission network. And we bring it down to southern Quebec, where all of our population lives. There's only 8.5 million of us in Quebec in total. So it's about the population of Metro New York City. And then we bring it further into markets. And that's probably the other big aspect of our activity in terms of greenhouse gases, is that because we sell into markets such as New York and New England, we actually displace fossil fuel generation. So when we're bidding into those markets, we're bidding at the same time as natural gas plants and whatever other coal and oil is left out there. And when it's our energy that's flowing, well, of course, that's not flowing. So year in, year out, it's about 7 million metric tons of GHGs that are not emitted thanks to our exports. It's pretty much the equivalent of 2 million cars being taken off the roads. So it's become such a very central part of our business strategy now, and has kind of bled over into corporate culture, where we're looking, of course, because we do have a commercial vocation at Hydro-Quebec. Even if we are state-owned, we do look at maximizing our revenues as much as possible because we send a dividend back to our stakeholder. But it also means that we're looking a little bit further than the bottom line. And especially under our current CEO, Sophie Brochu, she has really brought a much more human tint to the company. And looking past the bottom line, looking much more at who are the humans that are being affected by our operations, how can we move forward collectively as a society, realizing that we're in a transition. We're in a transition that's going to have winners and losers, and some of those losers we're going to have to help out. And I'm thinking particularly about some of the fossil fuel industries where there are going to be losses, and where we're going to have to go back and look at employment opportunities for some of those workers. So that's really our outlook on this type of thing. Looking very much forward to the discussion period and to the questions. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you very much, Gary. There's a number of, I was furiously taking notes to be able to come back to a number of those points around the just transition that I think we should certainly talk about. But right now, I would like to turn to Ranjit Lamek, Regional Director of Infrastructure for the East Asia and Pacific region from the World Bank. Ranjit, please share with us your thoughts.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you to all of you for inviting me to join this event. It's a topic that, I mean, close to my heart. I've spent a lot of time working with state-owned power companies much of my career, and if you'd asked me this question 20 years back, I might have had a somewhat different answer. So, my comments on this topic, what role and how I see the role of state power companies in climate transition, in moving to net zero. So I work on the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank. As I see it, it is sort of ground zero of the climate transition, given the nature of our clients, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, large coal users. But now on the starting conditions, I think it's important we reflect a moment on the starting conditions. What I mean by that is the extent of state ownership in the power sector in East Asia. Now you take a country like Korea. Korea, you have KEPCO and its subsidiaries. They collectively control 80% of the generation, thermal, nuclear, otherwise. KEPCO is center stage in Korea, more than 80% of the generation, and it's a state-owned entity. Go to Japan, and again, it varies in Japan. Some of the key power companies there have a huge ownership. You know, Tokyo Electric Power Company, Chubu, etc. Many of these were created, formed by actually the US post the World War. They have been privatized some, but it is still dominantly state-owned. Korea, Japan, moving on to Singapore. The Coal Power, the SP group, is mostly state-owned. I mean, it's held by Temasek Holdings. It's a state-owned entity. They control all the generation and transmission in Singapore. Work with direct, like Electricity Vietnam, EBN. You know, I began with EBN, the operator of an entity which was the size of a bungalow. They have two subsidiaries, controls about 80% Vietnam. Both low carbon, high carbon, and in between, and otherwise. PLN in Indonesia, that's own power company there. They control over 70% of the generation. There's lots of generation, but PLN manages the network, and they control a large share of the generation. Moving on to China. China again is mixed, but most of it, I would say, is state-owned. Even the subsidiary generation companies which generate, then the grid company is basically state-owned. Malaysia, now in Malaysia, this was one of my first times I worked with, and they graduated soon thereafter. Again, it's over 60, almost 70% state-owned, again, controlling most of the generation and all the transmission and distribution. So I think the point I'm basically making is, if we have to work on climate action, and I'll get into the reasons why, state-owned enterprises, at least in East Asia, are critical. Okay, I just got a message from Laurie saying that she would hear me better if I face the camera. I hope you can hear me well now. Now, all these countries in East Asia and elsewhere are definitely moving towards a net zero trajectory. Now, we may agree or disagree on the pace of change. China has, said that they would be net zero by 2060. Other countries in East Asia and also South Asia are also coming out with commitments. Vietnam is heading in the direction of net zero by 2060 as well. Let me outline 3 reasons why I think state-owned enterprises are going to be critical for the transition. Let me first begin with the financing challenge. Now, we've done some analysis of 4 of our major clients, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. It's our estimate that just meet their NDC commitments would take something like $8 trillion in the next 20 years. If the answer 80% in emissions, the number moves to about 10.5 trillion. Now, these are not insignificant amounts of money. I mean, typically this almost requires a doubling or a little more than doubling of the share of investment in new energy assets, which will be low carbon. So this is like 4 to 5% of GDP of investments that you need to make in low carbon assets. So, I mean, this is not all going to be public money. A lot of it is going to be private money. Private money will play a very, very key role here. In fact, it'll play the most substantive or the largest role here. But what we are hearing from the private sector, was Mark Carney was at a World Bank event shortly, about 2 weeks back, and we had several other etc. And have similar estimates in terms of the order of the private. But the repeated reference was, we need the public sector to help with the deal. More recently, you may have seen articles in the Times, we think, from BlackRock come out and say, yes, we have institutional resources, but we will need help on the deal. There are three reasons I say. The first one is planning. As each of these countries sets out a net zero trajectory, the planning function, while it could sort of remain the interstices between the regulator and governments, the state-owned entities, the roles they play in these countries, they're central to the planning and the transition. So from a planning perspective, the state-owned entities are going to play a very, very big role. Now, we may agree or disagree, and we may want to change that role, but at least as we move into the transition aggressively in the next few years, the planning function is largely going to have a state-owned power company role. The second reason I'd say is integration. We keep talking integration. Companies basically control and operate the network. They invest in the network and they dispatch the systems. So from an execution and implementation perspective, the role that these entities will play in integrating the large scale up in renewables, which we hope and expect will be largely done by the private sector, will require these complementary investments at scale. And we're finding that, in fact, this could be a constraint in Vietnam in the short term if the grid build out doesn't keep pace with the pace of investments that the Vietnamese are making in renewables and other low carbon sources. The third point I'd make is the one I sort of alluded to earlier on de-risking. Now, what we're going to see is moving somewhat back into an era where we are going to need long-term offtake agreements. Some of these technologies are at above market cost currently. Well, definitely, they're very competitive now, but it's clear that people will have to de-risk, or governments will have to de-risk, and this will require state power companies probably to take on longer term obligations, maybe at the distribution level, the network level, maybe at the single buyer level. Yes, these countries expect to move towards more competitive markets. You still have what level of competition will actually bring in the requisite level of low carbon, but at least in the next 4 or 5 years or longer, you will need substantial amount of de-risking of the private investments coming into the space. And there's a position there to do it, or there's no alternative entity position there to do it, at least in East Asia and Pacific, but the state-owned power companies. So it's central. We need to actuate a clean energy transition towards net zero. So
thank you very much, Ranjit. We're still having a little bit of trouble hearing you. I think when you don't move as much and when you look straight ahead, it's a bit easier for us to hear you, but I did take quite a few notes, and I think we'll be able to return to your topics. And now during the Q&A, I would just like to remind, for those of you who have just joined us, we're discussing engaging state-owned power companies in climate action. We will now move into a moderated discussion. We will open up to questions from the audience in just a few moments. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I would like to move to some of those questions right now. We have some very interesting questions that have already been submitted. I'd like to invite our panelists to join me by turning off their videos, or turning on their videos, pardon me. So Leonardo and Ranjit. I'm going to jump right in with some of the questions we have here. I'm going to start with one because I've been mulling it over since I first saw it as all of you were sharing your remarks. Anis Azuni has put in the question that these power companies operate in countries with weak institutional frameworks and are captured by principal agent relationships with the public sector, lack functioning domestic energy and power markets, and are generally not financially viable. The transformation needed is huge and is asking for comments. I'm going to hold back my own comments and allow the rest of you to comment, and then I'd like to comment. Philip, would you like to start? And then we'll move. I'd like to ask everyone to comment here because I think there's a lot to say.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's obviously a very important observation. And in fact, I mean, as Ranjit was describing, the World Bank has been working to try to strengthen the governance structures of these organizations. And that's very much what Leonardo was referring to. I think the point, though, that's important to recognize is notwithstanding the weaknesses that many state-owned power companies are exposed to, the fact of the matter is, as Ranjit very eloquently described in going through so many of the countries in the critical East Asia Pacific region, they are major players when it comes to power. So they are major players when it comes to what the emissions profile looks like. I will say that many organizations have spent decades trying to convince governments to get rid of their state-owned power companies without success. And when it comes to climate and emissions, we don't have time to continue to spend trying to convince governments to reform or privatize their state-owned power companies while they're continuing to emit. So I think what that means is we have to try to figure out a way to support and enable these entities, whether we like them or not, to basically be positive members of the low carbon transition. I mean, I think Hydro-Quebec shows that it can be done. I think it's also clear, it's also important to not underestimate the important role that these companies do play in the economies of many of these countries. And it's not like you can just turn them off from one day to the next. So I think what we need to do is really spend time and think about how can we support these companies in decarbonizing. Financing is a big issue. We can talk about the private sector financing point, but the fact of the matter is a lot of the capital is going to have to go to the companies that run the grids to permit renewables in there, as well as these companies that are going to continue to play a role in providing generation into these economies. So yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are reservations, but the fact of the matter is the reality is they are there and they're going to be there 10, 15 years from now. So we need to figure out a way how to help them support the low carbon transition.
And I would add to that, I'd like to turn to Leonardo, because I think that Leonardo in his 5 points hit on some particularly important aspects that have to do with the institutional functioning of these companies that I think respond to the challenges that came in with the question from Anis. I think that, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but Leonardo, would you like to comment on that? I know, having worked in the Mexican market and knowing the role that Leonardo played in working on the energy reform of 2013 and 2014 in Mexico, Leonardo, can you comment a little bit on some of those institutional aspects that you mentioned in your 5 points that address, I believe, the very questions that came in through the Q&A?
Yes, certainly, Laurie, and I fully agree with all the comments. Ranjit, the experience that he shared about the different countries. But focusing on Mexico, for instance, one of the challenges is precisely to access information. And one way to access information to assess what's happening with the organization is to publish the same data as a listed company. So in a way, if you actually list 10% of the company, you will have to adhere to these same standards, and would help you to understand how do you fare against other participants in the market. It will help you have a benchmark to compare with, and of course, to measure your progress towards those goals. And certainly with the same principles that you have to meet while you are listed in the stock exchange, then finance would be or access to finance would be eased, because there's a way to actually say, well, I can actually invest in this particular project because all the different metrics for this company make sense, and I will get a return on my investment. So, I agree with Philip, but I do not agree with Philip in the sense that saying privatization, probably it's an evil word, but it's not about the privatization per se, but it's about how can you open your books, and then you would be able to increase your transparency before your constituents, because you're a state-owned company, but also you would be opening your books for scrutiny to the financial sector, and then you would be able to lever your talent, your infrastructure, your market power with the complementing by the financial support of private sector entities or other public sector entities. So I guess what I am saying is perhaps do not focus on the privatization part, but perhaps focus on strengthening the corporate governance part.
And I would just add quickly too, part of the question that came in was the idea of these power entities operating in a context that lack a functioning domestic energy and power market. And I would add to what Leonardo's saying that I don't think we should focus so much on, just as Leonardo's saying, let's not focus on privatization. I wouldn't focus so much in the context that we're saying here about it seeking to have these companies engage in climate action. I would not focus so much on whether these countries have operating power markets in the way that we may think about them in the United States, for example, because having lived through the privatization wave in Latin America of the 1990s and knowing where we are today, I am less concerned about seeking a functioning trading power market in the way that we may think of them in the US or in parts of Europe when it comes to climate action than I am about governance and moving capital in the way that Ranjit was talking about, where the private sector of capital is saying we need to work with the public sector in order to mobilize our capital to foster the development of infrastructure, because that's really what we're talking about. We want to mobilize the development and construction of energy infrastructure that is low carbon. That's really what we're saying. And we need to move capital to do that. And there's plenty of capital out there. And in order to mobilize that capital, we need strong institutional structures. One of the things that Ranjit said that really affected me as a former developer is planning and permitting and things like dispatch and who controls the dispatch and who is running the system and who's going to build the interconnections and who's going to build the transmission, and all of those things I think about as a developer. And I am less concerned about whether there's a tradable market than I am about institutional frameworks and getting long-term PPAs and am I going to project finance this? And those are the things I'm more worried about than I am about a liquid trading market. So Gary or Ranjit, would you like to comment before I move on to another question?
Yeah, Lori, maybe just to pick up on your last point there, I think that's a really important factor to look at is who is performing all of those different functions, the interconnections, the transmission. I mean, we're talking about a lot of big infrastructure. And in my case, I'm not working in a weak institutional framework. I'm working in a very robust institutional framework, one that has been developed and kind of alongside our development for a long time now. But I guess what I'd say is that regardless of the climate urgency that we live through, the projects that we're putting out there as companies have to be good ones. They have to be sound, regardless of the requirements that are placed on us by our institutional frameworks. There are international standards that are involved with this. And I think we're seeing much more companies reaching out to other companies who have done this already, looking for advice, looking for the best way to do it. And we have to maintain that standard right across the board. but it's a tough one. It's a really tough one. And I think the other aspect that maybe we need to touch on here is that as a state-owned corporation, we don't have the same, I would say, financial clout as some of the private companies that we're going up against in some of these markets. And, you know, I look at what I focus my time on our US Northeast markets on a regular basis. And we are in direct competition with fossil fuel companies that have a whole lot more money to put into their projects and to put into their maintaining their bottom line than we do. And it's a problem. How do we bring these clean energy projects, be they generation projects or transmission projects, to get the energy from point A to point B to fruition when we're faced by all that opposition?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really valid point. And I'd like to ask Ranjit to comment on it, given the markets he's very familiar with and works in.
Sorry, I do agree with the point that yes, we have to.
Ranjit, we're losing you when you move. I know this is terrible for you to not be able to move while you speak, because I know I wave my arms all over the place.
And remain as
now we
still
can't
as
hear you.
possible. I mean,
Can you try turning off your video, maybe?
okay.
See if it's a Wi-Fi issue. No, now we can't hear you at all.
Okay.
Oh, now we hear you.
You hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
that's wonderful.
Okay. I will stay with this. Sorry. I
Great.
mean, I was using this headset. Maybe it's defunct. No, the point I make is, yes, the principal's role is really important. And let me illustrate that. And I agree that getting that relationship is important. So let's take the case, let's say, of Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, I would say they've got the principal-agent relationship sort of well articulated. What the role the government plays as the owner and what role the entity plays. So you have EVN today, which has an investment-grade credit rating. It meets any international benchmark on performance. And it's able to raise capital in international capital markets at very attractive rates. Yes, there may be an implicit sovereign backing out there, but they're able to do so. And the same we see in entities like Malaysia, Tenaga, Singapore, Korea, etc. These are all state-owned enterprises with principals playing the roles they should. Let me shift to the Philippines. Mostly privatized. I might question whether the principal is able to play its role effectively. The Philippines, if you look at it, has the highest power prices in East Asia. It's higher price power than Singapore. It's got higher price power than Korea, just about anywhere else. It's privatized. Is that an effective principal-agent relationship? I think not. So I don't think it's really about privatization here. So I do agree with the point that it is about how the principal plays its role, the government as its owner. And we see very good examples in East Asia, which, you know, I think state enterprises anywhere else in the world could aspire to. But let me stop there. Thank you.
I'd like to take it a step further, and we've got a number of questions that have to do with coal generation and the carbon mix of generation as part of the transition, and the prevalence in a number of state-owned enterprises of coal and how to move these state-owned enterprises off coal. And Ranjit, I'm not familiar with the generation mix in the Philippines, for example. So in your case, when you look at the Philippines, are you looking at a situation where those high power prices have to do with tariff structure, have to do with inefficiencies, have to do with the generation mix? What is your thought?
I'll talk a little bit of the Philippines. It's probably how the principal-agent relationship and the choices that the private sector has made, the pass-through of the regulation. So you have all these structures in place, ostensibly. Good, you know, what we would have thought 15 years back, and still continues to be good regulatory practice. But clearly, the choices the private sector has made within that regulatory framework are leading to high power prices, you know, so somebody is making a lot of money in the process. But then on the carbon intensity of the generation, yes, you see carbon intensive generation in the Philippines. They're building a lot more coal. They plan to build about 20 gigawatts of coal more. Vietnam, went in quite aggressively with coal, but they're aggressively scaling that back, consistent with their net zero commitment. So yeah, I'm not giving you a full answer because probably I don't understand the question exactly, but yeah.
That's because I probably conflated two questions. So that one's on me. You know, one of the questions that we're getting, for example, here, and this is a very important one. The pursuit of net zero carbon emission electricity could be difficult for developing countries to achieve as they need to improve their own standard of living and industrialization. What can be offered to countries to counter this, as coal is still the single most efficient power source for them? So let's take the question around coal to a higher level, which is really something Philip and I spend a lot of time talking about. The global carbon budget, as we call it. Who is to decide? And as countries quite rightly are prioritizing improving the quality of life of their citizens, how do we help and think about reducing carbon emissions in that context as part of the energy transition?
Extremely important question. I'll just throw out a few numbers. You know, the analysis we've done shows that if you went for the aggressive decarbonization scenario in at least the principal EAP coal using countries, and this is not even net zero, this is like 80% reduction in emissions, you're on average going to see, I mean, you need to invest a lot immediately. It's not about investing later. I need to invest immediately. Renewables, low carbon generation sources tend to have a higher investment cost upfront. They have very low operating costs going forward. So you need the money now, and you need to pay for these investments. We see that the tariff increases that would be required would be 26, 30% higher than they are currently. At some level, this may seem modest, but this is not. You know, we have, you know, look at the issues we are facing in Europe today, or the demonstrations you had in France about a year and a half, two back, with fairly modest increases. Now, I don't think many developing countries will be able to sustain, or countries in East Asia, those levels of tariff increase. It's going to affect both competitiveness. I mean, Vietnam wants to produce iPhones and Nike shoes. The people in these countries would like to air condition their homes. I mean, you know, they would like to reach Singaporean standards of living. I mean, the only reason people can live in Singapore is you have every space is air conditioned. So conceivably, you know, Vietnamese, Indonesians, Chinese, Filipinos, and others are going to be looking for the same standards of living. And a 30+% tariff increases is not sustainable. You can apportion these costs differently, is that you have taxpayers pay for it, or perhaps the international community needs to come in. I mean, from an equity perspective, and I mean, and that's why people are talking about the $100 billion per year at COP, or even more now. Where are these resources going to come from? I think is a global issue. Yeah, I mean, I may have ideas on where these resources need to come from, but we are not going to move effectively to net zero unless there's a significant amount of grant funding that comes in from those who have consumed a large part of the carbon budget in the last several decades or centuries.
Philip, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, coming on this issue of coal, because I think there's an interesting intersection when we're talking about state-owned power companies. And that is that obviously a lot of state-owned power companies own a lot of coal. And I think the critical issue is, and I think about it, I know there are discussions about these early retirement programs and the like. Critical thing to remember is going back to the principle of the owner of the government. The objective of the government isn't so much to promote a particular form of power generation, but rather to get electrons into the system. So as we think about trying to encourage retirement of coal plants, the critical issue isn't so much paying out the owners of those plants, and that becomes obvious when the owners of those plants are state-owned power companies, but it's rather giving them the ability to produce alternatives. So if you take kilowatts out of the system, you need to put alternative kilowatts into the system. And in fact, you need to put in more kilowatt hours into the system because these economies are growing. So that very much goes to the point that Ranjit was making, which is you need to generate the financing to build out the system if you want to get rid of coal. The second thing is to recognize, having said that, that a lot of time the alternatives to coal smaller scale renewables and like are often not done by large entities, and state-owned enterprises are better as large operators rather than as small operators. So it is clear that as you think about the transition and you think about what the electricity generation profile might look like in the future in Vietnam, you're likely to probably see more smaller operators in a low carbon transition than having a single big dominant set of operators, which is often the state-owned company. So to basically say, coming back in some ways to Leonardo's point in the life, which is that we do want to improve the corporate governance of state-owned enterprises, but it's also important for governments to change their regulatory frameworks to allow entry by smaller players that are often better adapted at providing some of these renewables. And then the last thing I just want to make is sometimes I think there's a certain confusion. People say, oh, what is 70% I think of the financing needs to come from the private sector. That doesn't mean that 70% of the financing from the private sector goes to the private sector. State-owned enterprises are also recipients of private capital. And in fact, improving the corporate governance of state-owned enterprises to be able to tap into private capital is an integral part of the story. So, it's important, right? As generators, as funders, as operators, as transmission companies, they may not be as dominant in a future in which we have a successful energy transition, but they're very dominant today. They're very dominant in particular in the coal sector. And so we really need to figure out how to get them out of coal. And part of that is providing the means for alternative forms of kilowatt hours.
I think you're absolutely correct. And as Leonardo knows well, you create conditions to provide long-term offtake agreements from state-owned companies, and that private capital will be attracted automatically. One of the things I think that is really challenging, and there were some comments that alluded to it earlier, is I think it was you, Ranjit, who mentioned the planning piece, how important that is. That the state-owned companies often are in the role of managing dispatch and managing planning, and they will continue to play that role. And the private companies can be involved in building the generation, but that planning is going to be so key. The scale at which this needs to occur and the amount of infrastructure that needs to be built in the next decade or 15 to 20 years is such that we need to find a way to make our planning systems more agile across the board in all of the countries I think that we've mentioned and many that we have not. And that is something I think that we tend to overlook. We can mobilize as much capital as we want, but if we do not find a way to help all of these state-owned companies and their related regulatory entities to make these systems more agile in the planning process, be it interconnection, all of the related permits, we will not meet our goals. And that's probably another webinar, but I just wanted to mention that, having dealt with it. So I think we
Laurie,
are, yeah, please, Gary.
If I could just say something really quickly on that, because I think that's a key issue here when we're looking at moving towards more clean energy, is that we've established these nice constructs like ISOs or regional transmission organizations that handle how we do business in the electricity sector. But those are not really reflective of where we're moving to. We're going now towards the source of energy, and that could be hydro, it could be wind, it could be solar, but that's not necessarily really close to where your population lives. So I think we're going to be looking at much more a situation of interregional planning, and we're going to have to knock our heads together on a much wider geographical basis if we're going to actually push ourselves to decarbonize our energy sector. And it's kind of a little bit against our nature, because we like these nice constructs that we have good control over. But I think one thing that we have to kind of move to in the energy sector, we're very good at thinking about generation, how we generate, how we push it towards the client through a transmission and a distribution network. We're not so good about thinking about that client at the end of the day, that customer. And my CEO loves to say, there are no electricity customers out there who like paying their electricity bill. It doesn't exist. And we have to think about what that person's needs are and how we can respond to those needs, not about how we can get our generation into their electricity outlets. So we have to flip that equation, as many industries around the world have flipped it. right? We're much more customer focused in a lot of energy and a lot of different types of industries, but we're not in the energy sector yet. So how can we do that? And how can we focus on the customer? How can we focus on their needs, keeping their bill down as much as possible, but offering them a solution where they're getting clean air, they're getting a source of energy that they can be proud of, and they're giving, you know, back a little bit to the climate change equation. And that's, I think, a really important thing that we haven't managed to capture. When we burn gas, when we burn coal, we're affecting local air. And that's a big part of the equation that we have a whole lot of trouble putting a dollar figure on and putting into the equation, in the same way that we have a big problem still putting a dollar figure on carbon. So my cry from the heart out to the economists out there who know about this stuff a whole lot more than I do is, let's look at this holistically and let's try and really boil it down so that we get the right solution at the right time for the right people.
I think you're absolutely correct, Gary. And I think we will close on that note. It's about human health, and it's about people. And having been involved in a webinar where your CEO spoke, I can vouch for how eloquent she is on that topic as well. I want to thank all of you. We are close to the end here. So I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. Our next event, Columbia Energy Straight Talk with Cheryl LaFleur and David Hill, Energy Law and Policy, A View from the Bench with Judge Thomas B. Griffith, will be held on Monday, November 8th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And for a full calendar of our upcoming events, visit the Center on Global Energy Policy online. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much to all of you for an enjoyable conversation. It was a great way for me to start the day, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.